We're going to be going through sports psychology for cycling coaches. And this webinar is with TrainingPeaks and British Cycling Together. I'm Melissa Schwartz from TrainingPeaks, and we are super excited with this partnership to be doing these webinars with British Cycling. We've got Dr. Jamie Barker, who's a registered sports and exercise psychologist from Staffordshire University. And we also have Andy Kirkland, who's a coaching education officer at British Cycling. They're going to be taking us through the content of the webinar. If you have a question that you'd like Andy or Jamie to answer at the end, go ahead and you can either put it out on Twitter. So we've got the hashtag coaching webinar on Twitter, and someone's going to be monitoring that and answering questions that way. And we're also going to be looking at questions via the go-to interface. So there's a little section for questions. You can click on it and enter a question, and then I will be reading them, collecting them throughout the webinar, and at the very end we'll give questions to Andy and Jamie to answer. So there's two ways to do that. We also encourage you, you can see up there on the screen, to follow us on Twitter. We've got the British Cycling Coaches Twitter handle, the one for TrainingPeaks and one for Dr. Jamie as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you guys.
Welcome to everyone, and I'm Andy Kirkland, a coach and education officer at British Cycling, and we're absolutely delighted to be working in partnership with TrainingPeaks, especially over there in what we've heard is about to become snowy Colorado. Now, the aims of tonight are to look at the role of the coach in influencing behaviour. So we believe at British Cycling that influencing the behaviour of riders is absolutely fundamental to everything a coach does. So whether it's working on training, developing young riders or whatever, the ability of the coach to influence behaviour is absolutely key to their effectiveness. Now, we're going to look at the core principles to develop riders that we use within British Cycling, and Jamie's going to take us through understanding ourselves, so understanding what goes on in our own minds as a starting point to work with others. Key to us as well is promoting long-term development, so that's not just taking a snapshot of a rider and working with them over the short term, it's thinking about the long term. And towards the end of the presentation, we'll look at core psychological skills that coaches and riders and other athletes need to develop throughout their cycling pathway to be the best riders they can. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Dr. Jamie Barker.
Hello, this is Jamie here, and I guess I'm just going to pick up on a couple of things that Andy's just been talking about there. And I guess really when we talk about psychology, one of the key things is really understanding the self and understanding the I. And I guess a lot of work that we do with athletes is about developing self-awareness so that they can understand themselves, and that's often at a very basic level, so they can really understand what they think and how they feel and so forth. And I guess if we're trying to establish change and make people behave and react differently to different situations, it's really important that they have an understanding and an awareness of what they currently do. In terms of sports psychology, I think sometimes, you know, my dad often thinks it's related to pub talk, and it's often very straightforward. And I think that, you know, psychology is common sense. It's very simple. It's common sense that often a lot of people don't do particularly well. So in our work, what we typically do is we help people to think smart. We help people to behave appropriately to maximize their performance. And in sport, we often find that people don't think appropriately. They don't think the right things. We often find that they think negatively. They often beat themselves up after a failure. They're often particularly worried or anxious about an up-and-coming event. So our role particularly is to get them to often to think more appropriately, to accordingly behave better. And I guess in its rawest sense, psychology is really the study of the science of the mind and how this influences behavior. So we're really interested in how people think and how they ultimately behave. And I guess one of my downsides as a human being is that when I tend to go to a coffee shop, what I'm very, very bad at doing, my wife would tell me, is that I'm very bad at observing people and watching what people particularly do. And I guess the role of the psychologist is often to observe people, to often see what people do in various situations. Professional sport, elite sport, provides us with a fantastic example of real life, real world experiments where we can see people in the reality of their actual performances, so we can understand how they behave and how they react. And sports psychology, in essence, is one of the, I guess, one of the big four sciences when we talk about sports science. We often think about biomechanics, physiology, psychology, and nutrition. And increasingly, what we find is in elite sport in particular, psychology is probably one of the big distinguishing factors between success and failure. Of course, recognizing that there are also many other factors that influence how individuals and how performers actually do in the competition arena. So I guess the first way to relate psychology to coaches is really to get them to, or get you guys to think about how you currently operate. And one of the key skills that we often talk about in psychology is this notion of reflective practice. It's really about trying to work out where you currently are so that you can develop a pathway to improve and develop. And I guess really it's about trying to integrate this link between knowledge and experience. So every time that we receive a piece of information, every time that we have an experience when we're coaching, we try and learn from it. We try and take stock of what it is we actually did, how it made us feel, and how those maybe around us reacted. And then we try and use that to try and influence what we might do in the future. And particularly when we think about coaching, some of the key questions to ask ourselves are, how do you know how to do what you do? So for example, do we have some illustrations in coaching where we might be able to think about, actually, how am I most effective? How do I convey the most appropriate information to my riders or to my athletes that I'm working with? We also might start to think about where you've developed that understanding from. So where do we acquire our knowledge? Do we rely on a mentor? Do we rely on textbooks? Do we tune into webinars? Where do we actually create our information from? Is our information that we gather the most appropriate? Is it effective for our practice? Think also as well in coaching about what processes we've been through. Maybe think about our experiences. How did we learn to coach? Did we learn from a mentor? Did we have a good mentor who gives us fantastic experience and fantastic illustrations? Or do sometimes we think, actually, they're a little bit one-dimensional in how they perhaps think or convey certain information? And I guess probably most important when we're coaching is, how do we know what is the most appropriate or most effective? And I guess to some extent we kind of know that from over time through knowledge and experience and beginning to link the two together. I don't know, Andy, is there anything you'd like to add on that when we're talking about reflective practice in coaching?
Yeah, I think reflective practice is absolutely key. So one question when I'm lecturing or whatever to groups is to get everyone to shut their eyes, and I'll ask, do you believe in the saying, practice makes perfect? And the majority of people, 70–80%, will put up their hands and say, yes, we believe practice makes perfect. But in fact, practice makes permanent. So without reflection, we can never aspire to be the best we can be.
When we talk about reflective practice as well, I think it's worth bearing in mind it's a never-ending story. It's going around in a circle all the time. So we have an experience, we take stock of it, we learn from it, we might share some of that information with others. And we can reflect in many different ways. We can reflect through blogs, we can reflect through diaries. One of the key skills I often like the athletes and coaches I work with to do is to keep a reflective diary. So after every training session that they may have delivered, or every coach education session, they might actually write down three things that went well, three things that actually they were quite pleased with, and then write one thing actually they think they could improve on. The good things that we've done. So that's quite a simple strategy, but one that just helps people to get involved in that process of reflection. If we think also about understanding your coaching, I guess it's really about what is the purpose of your coaching. Why do you coach? So as a psychologist, I would have a philosophy, I would have a way in which I work, And likewise, for coaching, it's very important to have almost a staple diet and think about, how do I actually want to coach? How do I want my athletes to interact with me? How do I want them to perceive me? Do I want them to perceive me as being authoritarian? Do I want them to perceive me as particularly democratic? So I think that's really important, that whenever we're setting ourselves up as a coach or a psychologist, that we actually have an understanding of our philosophy, our approach. But also as well, what are our outcomes? What do we actually want? What do we expect of perhaps those around us? When we think about reflection and we're talking about understanding our coaching, and also an interesting thing is to think about, what would it be like to be coached by you? What would your riders say about you as a coach? What do you think your strengths, what do you think your weaknesses would be? And sometimes that information can be quite damning, but actually if we're thinking about developing ourselves as coaches, that information is very rich, it's very powerful. And we know that some of the most successful people in the world actually embrace feedback. They actually, to some extent, like criticism, because it actually helps them to develop and iron out some of those areas that makes them least effective. And then I guess the third part of this triangle that we're thinking about here is, what approaches and perspectives do you draw on in coaching? So for example, what sort of continual professional development activities do we do? What sort of workshops do we sign up to? What type of webinars do we engage in? Who do we follow on Twitter? But also as well thinking about mentors that we relate to, and thinking about where the best pieces of information are for us and how we access that. So in essence, I think understanding our coaching is based around philosophy. It's based around understanding how we want our riders or our athletes to perceive us. It's also thinking about what approaches we have. I think quite integral to that is thinking about actually watching ourselves. It's quite difficult, sometimes it's quite embarrassing, but actually if we could video our own sessions and watch ourselves, that would harness a lot of reflection. It helps us to understand maybe some of our body language, some of our messages that we convey, but also as well getting some feedback about our performance and feedback from athletes that we work with. So developing the psychology for the rider. And when we talk about riders trying to achieve their potential, from a psychological point of view, we think about riders engaging and using a number of psychological skills. And really psychological skills are tools. It's really as a psychologist, it's our staple diet that we use with individuals to maximize their performance. And there are many psychological skills that we can provide to individuals. And hopefully over the course of this session tonight, we'll provide you with information on a few of the most important ones, and perhaps some of the easier skills to integrate with riders. But really these psychological skills are tools to try and bring about changes in how people think, how they feel, and ultimately how they behave. And as with anything in terms of skill-based, it takes time. It takes time to master. I have often worked with a lot of athletes who require a quick fix. They want to feel differently on a Saturday as they did last week. And sometimes they come to psychology and they think that will provide me with the answer. But actually the reality is very, very different. Psychological skills, like physical skills, take time to master. They take time to develop, and therefore it's really important that as a coach, we continually reinforce these psychological skills. We continually remind the athletes, the riders, that they need to do these. And I guess, but where possible as coaches, we try and allow opportunity for psychological skill development within the sessions, within the training sessions that we provide. Because then that allows athletes to actually realize that psychology is important. It isn't just something that's added on. If they see it as being built into their sessions, it begins to become something they just commonly do, becomes second nature to them. When we're using psychological skills with individuals, one of the big problems that we find is that whilst a lot of athletes and individuals recognize them to be important, we often find without reminders, people are pretty bad at doing them on a regular basis. So they actually choose to do anything but these psychological skills, even though that they know they're actually quite helpful. And adherence is no surprising thing to human behavior. We know that smoking kills. We know that exercise is good for us. But actually, human beings are pretty stupid in some respects. And sometimes the things that are good for us, we actually don't do on a regular basis. So as a coach, as a psychologist, we often find that we continually have to remind athletes to do these skills on a regular basis. In terms of our journey of understanding others, I think it's really important that as coaches, that we recognise that generally athletes and human beings per se really have huge potential, and this is based upon really a humanistic approach to understanding psychology. And by that, what we mean is that actually human beings have a tendency to be good. They have a tendency towards personal growth. They want to develop. They want to become the best that they can be. And I think sometimes when we are working as psychologists and coaches, it's quite easy to think actually people can't be bothered. They actually want to get out of training sessions. They actually want to be deviant. But actually, generally speaking, people are good. They have good intentions and they do want to fulfill their potential. It's also worth bearing in mind as well that coaches, athletes, and other people not related to sport do have different perceptions of reality. They do have what we call different maps of reality. And that is that you, Andy, and I will have different perspectives on what success and failure are. We will have different expectations about how we want people to behave. And I think that's really important that when we are coaching, that we have an understanding that those that we're coaching will have different expectations of us, themselves, and perhaps the context that they're in. And from yourself, Andy, is there any examples, or do you think that is a familiar tone of which you sort of pick up on?
Well, I think it's incredibly important to understand and consider the needs of the athletes before ourselves. So another saying that I tend to think about is a really common one that most people believe is treat others the way that you want to be treated yourself, when in fact it's more important to consider treating people the way that they want to be treated. So if I was involved in a talent team squad up in Scotland a number of years ago, and the riders had a bad day. They were walking the walk, talking the talk, had their nice bikes, and simply hadn't performed. Myself and the other coach were upset, we were angry, and that reflected in our behaviour towards the coaches. When in fact, on reflection, we went away, spoke about it later, and realised that we were actually wanting these riders to succeed more than they did at that time in their life, whereas they simply, at their age, wanted to be with their friends. So we were trying to impose our beliefs onto the riders, when in fact we probably had a negative effect on them by doing that. So we were thinking about ourselves rather than the riders.
Excellent. Oh, that's really a really nice example, I think. And I think, you know, sometimes when we're thinking about expectations, these can be very wide ranging. And we often think about expectations, and a lot of our work that we do in elite sport is actually trying to reduce the expectations that people put on themselves, because we actually find them very damaging. We find that people have extremely high, irrational, unhelpful expectations. They actually suffer a lot of anxiety. They suffer a lot of worry, because actually they're very perfectionistic. That is, they're searching for something that can never be achieved. Now, we're not trying to profess here that we want individuals who don't care or don't want to be the best. But actually, if we set unrealistic targets every training session, and if we continually beat ourselves up after a failure, then the likelihood is that we're probably not going to enjoy our sport for a particularly long period of time. We're likely to get annoyed with it, we're likely to get annoyed with our coaches, and probably drop out. So I guess the message being that when we are coaching, it's interesting to understand what our own expectations are, and be careful that we're not imposing those upon others. And I guess where we can, try and make sure that the beliefs, the expectations that we have are perhaps realistic for ourselves and for those around us. The third point here is that really relates to something I said earlier, that actually people have really good intentions. And that when we are coaching, you know, nobody wants to make a mistake. Nobody makes mistakes on purpose. And therefore, if somebody doesn't fulfill their target, it isn't because they're silly, because they're stupid. It's often because they just haven't performed on that particular given day for whatever reason. But sometimes just because they've done that, that doesn't mean they're a complete and utter failure. And often what we find is that a lot of athletes and individuals learn best when they've actually suffered a setback. And if it's couched in the right way, setbacks can be a really important learning experience for coaches, for athletes, and for individuals per se. And what I mean by that is that actually we learn from our mistakes. We learn, how could I actually not repeat this? How could I overcome this situation so I don't ultimately encounter it again? So this slide here really is when we're talking about understanding others, we're really talking about it from a coaching perspective and really trying to develop what we call an optimal coaching mindset. So where we think about having people with huge potential, people have different reality maps, and people generally have good intentions to want to be successful and push boundaries. So what is the role of the cycling coach then as an applied psychologist? So very quickly, within 20 minutes, we've got you to round hopefully being applied psychologists, and we're hopefully going to continue you on that journey for the remainder of the session tonight, so that you have a little bit more understanding of the role of psychology in your coaching and how you can apply this to your riders. And really we see the cycling coach as an applied psychologist really to improve the performance of your riders. Try and train your riders to better use the principles that perhaps we've identified earlier, and hopefully some of the things that we'll look at further on this evening. And I think really the core skills of being an effective psychologist and an effective coach are really about asking effective questions. They're really about listening to what others say, listening to what your athletes want, but also as well listening to yourself about the demands, the expectations, and maybe that little person that sits on your shoulder telling you that you're rubbish or telling you that you're great. Sometimes it's tuning into that and being aware of that little dialogue that we often have going on in our minds. Third point really is it's about building relationships. It's about building relationships with other coaches, learning, sharing support networks, debriefing, reflection, as we've mentioned earlier, but importantly building relationships with our athletes. And I think particularly the relationship we have with athletes can be one of many things. I guess at first port of call, it's probably going to be quite professional. Secondly, we might act as a mentor. They might be somebody who they choose to confide in, whether it be personal issues or whether it be cycling related. I think thirdly, we provide support. We generally, as coaches and psychologists, we big people up. We help them to deal with the successes. We help them to deal with the failures. And I think fourthly, being an effective coach and the role of a psychologist is probably about conveying knowledge and understanding. It's about helping people to understand how they can maximize their riding. It's also about providing them with specific knowledge, maybe about tactics, maybe about training habits, and maybe about how to maximize themselves. And just bring Andy in at this point. Is there anything that you think I've missed off there in terms of the role of a cycling coach as an applied psychologist?
I think they're so ingrained in that everything a coach does is reflective of their own behaviour and the behaviour of others, and it is all about influencing that behaviour. Listening is key for me though, because as a coach educator, I've seen literally hundreds of coaches delivering sessions, and one of the biggest limitations we see is the ability to listen. So another saying I like my little sayings is that we've got 2 ears and 1 mouth. Use them in that proportion. So it's more important to understand what the riders are thinking, what they're saying, and getting their views. If someone is very, very quiet and a rider's very quiet, not forthcoming in telling us stuff, that might actually be the rider with the most worthwhile thing to say as well. So it takes a great deal of skill to be able to influence the behaviour of that individual to find out what they're thinking. And they might be reflective or shy, but they've got some great thoughts to share with other riders too, and they can really become leaders that way. Right, so in this slide we've got the core principles of the Great Britain cycling team. Now, we are one of the most successful governing bodies in the world, and that's been built on the success of the elite squad. And fundamental to that success, and someone that's recognised across the board from Chris Hoy, Victoria Pendleton, is Dr. Steve Peters, who has worked on influencing their behaviour. So within the programme, there are core principles. Now, the first one before I go into the core principles, we've got a rule as coaches within British cycling is that we never say my rider. That is an absolute faux pas. It's always the rider that I coach. And the most successful coaches are the ones that aren't needed anymore. So it means developing a rider in the way that's best for them so that they become really, really independent. And these core principles underpin everything. So it's having commitment and understanding what they want to be as a person. So if someone comes onto a program and says, I want to be go to university and be really, really successful at university and get an education, well, that's not entirely consistent with wanting to be the absolute best rider in the world. So they've got to be absolutely committed to the cause. And part of that is actually loving the sport and wanting to do well in the sport. So we all have heard of Mark Cavendish. So regardless of whether he was getting paid or not, he would be on his bike most days because he absolutely loves and is committed to it. It's also for an individual to have ownership of their own program. So they've got to, without that ownership, then it's really doing something for someone else. And that external motivation isn't the best way towards success. Responsibility, so taking responsibility for their own actions, and this works across life. So if a rider isn't successful or doesn't develop in the way that they aspire to, then ultimately they are responsible for their own actions and they can take control of it. As individuals, we can only control our own behaviours and our own actions. It's more problematic if we don't like something someone else is doing, to control them. It's almost impossible to do. So it's taking responsibility for one's own actions. And excellence. So excellence within the program is about winning gold medals and being the best in the world. However, in coaching practice, it's doing the best job we can possibly do and using all the tools we can to achieve that. So as Jamie was talking about earlier, aspiring towards excellence requires an open mind, a willingness to learn, and a willingness to look for the most effective ways to do things. So because without that mindset, we're going to miss a trick, or miss hundreds of tricks even. So if we've been coaching for 20 years and doing the same thing over that 20 years, chances are things have moved on, and that's not aspiring to excellence. So back over to Jamie.
Just on, thanks Andy, that's some really interesting insight into how how GB cycling operate. And just on that point of excellence, I think one of the key things that we try to work on quite a bit with our athletes is this notion of what we call super strengths, and that sometimes it's important, probably at the early ages, that individuals know their strengths and weaknesses as riders. But actually, when they reach a certain level, it's about saying, okay, what can I be world's best at? And using some of that language actually promotes feelings of enjoyment, satisfaction, but also begins to bolster people's confidence. When we start talking about, actually, how can I be the world's best? What do I have as strengths that I could actually maximize and become unbelievably good at? And sometimes when we start talking in that language, often people are a little bit surprised by that we've just had a comment on Twitter from Chris Soper, who made the comment that there can be a big difference in expectations when coaching young riders with parents who ride themselves. I think this is a really good point, and particularly when we're working in youth sport, what we commonly find as psychologists is a lot of parental pressures. So often parents put in perhaps undue pressures on their athletes to either overachieve or to do as they did when they were perhaps competing or are still competing in those sports. And I guess the role of the parent is hugely important in the development of young athletes, but actually can be potentially damaging as well. And certainly in our work in parent education, when working at clubs and with teams, we do a lot of work on trying to almost teach parents when they're driving their child to and from an event, the type of questions they ask, at the end of an event can be deeply damaging in terms of confidence, but also motivation. So we really look at the parents as allies and not aliens in developing riders and developing athletes. And I think that's a really important thing, that sometimes, again, as individuals, we impose our expectations on those around us without perhaps understanding what a young athlete and what a young rider requires.
Yeah, I would probably add that I've worked at a similar level, working with parents all the time, and we've got to remember that parents want the best for their children, and sometimes as coaches we're like a helicopter looking in and seeing a different side to it and thinking, actually the parents aren't doing the best for their children simply because they've not got an understanding of working in that environment. So in the National Cycling Centre here, we consistently see young kids, 13, 14, coming in with £3,000 bikes. So we're talking $6,000 bikes, carbon wheels or whatever. And that can be really frustrating for coaches, because we see that we understand that for riders to do the absolutely best that they can do, it's not about equipment, it's more about developing a work ethic and understanding how to put their best into an effort. Particularly at a young age, equipment doesn't play a major role in success or failure. So it's really important that from a British cycling perspective, we engage with coaches and demonstrate what are really important about coaching, so that coaches can pass that on to parents. And it means, if parents are picking their kids up from a session, it means speaking to them and getting to know them.
Excellent. If we just further start to think about the cycling coaches and applied psychologists, we can really start to think now a little bit more about these core psychological skills, and we're going to have a little bit more of an in-depth look at some of these as we go through the remainder of the session. But really what we're trying to do here, I guess, is improve the performance of your riders. That's what these psychological skills are for. They're trying to really promote excellence, promote engine. And of course, those are really critical behaviours. Effort, persistence are really core to becoming successful, and also a rider that enjoys what they do, I guess. So when we think of these core psychological aspects or skills, we think of motivation. We think about, what drives somebody. Why do they want to commit so much of their time to doing something that's physically demanding, mentally tough, and is going to at some point probably require them to deal with an injury or injuries. So of course, doing something like cycling, as in any sport, requires a level of motivation. It also, going clockwise around this model, we also start to think about building and maintaining confidence. And I'll talk later on about the importance of self-confidence, but I always kind of take the point that actually, if confidence could be packed into a psychological pill, it would probably be the most widely prescribed pill that anybody would take. We can never have enough self-confidence. It's probably the most important psychological factor there is out there, because it gives us so many benefits. And I'll talk more in detail about what they are. The third aspect is about thoughts that we have and about the control of those thoughts. And as I mentioned earlier, that sometimes we'll go into situations and we'll have often beaten ourselves up so much that we will just render ourselves incapable of dealing with that pressure. And as coaches, we may have gone into a session where we've thought, oh, I don't want to deliver this session, I don't feel up for this today. And often our performance will reflect that. So the thoughts that we have is key, because they influence the feelings and they influence the behaviour that we do. So we need to take stock of our thoughts. We need to be aware of them, but we also need to take control of them and be able to control them and perhaps restructure them or reframe them when it's all appropriate. When we're thinking about performance at the top end in particular, dealing with stress is probably one of the key factors. If we think about competing in the Olympics, that for most people is a stressful event. It's probably one of, if not the most stressful life event. But actually it makes no sense that somebody would spend 4 years dedicating hours and hours of their time and sweat and toil to get anxious and to become stressful about it. So actually the mind begins to take over there. It tells us that because it means so much to us, we actually respond in a stressful way. But actually we can teach people to bizarrely look forward to pressure, look forward to the Olympic final, and even in some respects look forward to pressurized and exam situations. Because what commonly happens is people get quite anxious, they get worried, and they get threatened by situations where they're likely to be evaluated, they're likely to be a reward or punishment at the end of it. And of course our mind plays very, very good tricks on us in convincing us that we should be worried. But actually as psychologists, we can actually restructure that so we can help people to deal with pressure a lot more effectively.
Yeah, just to come in on the side of confidence, the previous webinar was on coaching women and girls. So what we've got to remember is that, well, one of the limitations or one of the issues when coaching females is some tend to have quite low self-confidence. So putting them in a pressureful situation too early may stop them participating in the sport. So if we're looking at long-term development of a rider, it's just understanding their level of confidence. And if you push them too hard too soon in their development or even in a series of sessions, that may affect them in the future. So it's understanding where their confidence is at and fostering an approach that gives them the best chance to reach their potential and to develop their self-confidence when you're doing so.
And that's a really good point. And I think that, you know, when individuals are learning new skills, it's important that we don't put them under stress, because often if it's an unlearned skill, if it's a new skill, those skills will break down when we put under particular pressure or stress. And often just by doing a demonstration in front of an audience can be enough to actually get somebody to really underperform, to get a young athlete in front of an audience to do something they're perhaps not particularly good at doing. That can be enough to really dent their confidence, to dent their belief, and potentially their enjoyment in what they're doing. The last aspect of psychological skills, if you like, is about emotions and how we control our emotions. You know, we are all aware of the emotions that affect our own performance, whether we're coaching, whether we are delivering a session, or even the emotions our riders display when in training and competition. And therefore, if we can begin to learn to control our emotions, we often become more effective, but we also begin to enjoy what we do a lot more. So we're going to go on and have a look at some of these in a lot more detail. And it was worth just probably identifying that you might be asking where have those psychological skills come from. And I guess the research evidence in sports psychology that has been done with Olympic athletes and successful sports people tells us that these are some of really the core critical skills that individuals will require, but also that coaches need to become comfortable in understanding so that they can avoid but also support riders when in their sessions. A model that we like to use in our practice that is taken really from a colleague of mine at Loughborough University in the UK is the 5 C's framework by Dr Chris Harwood. And Chris Harwood and I have worked on this particular approach, or Chris in particular has worked on this approach, and this is something that I've commonly used in our practice to really help individuals, coaches and athletes to understand the core components of psychology and how that might impact upon what they do. And we call it the 5 C's. And we really talk about in terms of commitment, we talk about motivation, I guess, but we often really want individuals to understand what commitment is about. We want them to have an understanding of the demands that are required perhaps to fulfill their potential. And the role of the coach, I guess, is to think about how can we maximize that? How can we actually increase people's commitment to the sport, whether they be coming into the sport as an entry level or whether they're progressing through the developmental stages. The second C is about communication. And we talk here about successful people being very, very good at communicating, not only with themselves, but with those around them. And we find that successful people, we find that elite asking for support. So for example, I can think of one athlete from a particular sport who'd be very good at challenging some of the messages that I would say to him. And he would say, well, how does that work? Is that the right thing for me to be doing? And I think often we might fall into a situation where we think, okay, well, is this athlete being a bit of a pain in the backside? But actually, no, that's the sort of athlete that
Can I just add there that these are life skills as well? So we've got quite a lot of coaches out there working at grassroots level. So we talk about coaching the whole rider. So not everyone's going to be an Olympic athlete. In fact, not everyone's going to stay in sport for the rest of their lives. But commitment, communication, concentration, confidence and control go into the workplace. They go into school. They go into everything in life, basically. So through coaching, we can develop people rather than simply just athletes. So I certainly know in a swimming squad I was in many years ago, the majority of the squad, because we had to be up at 6 a.m. in the morning, pushing it really hard, in the pool again in the evening, developed a real commitment in the discipline, and everyone was really, really successful at university within the squad. We weren't the bunch that went out drinking or whatever, because we were committed to our sport, and that transferred into the academic side for us as well.
It's a really interesting point about, you know, these 5 C's that we're talking about. They really are life skills, as Andy says, and I think one of the big selling points often when we're working with athletes is to say that actually these skills, these are going to help you perform better, but they're also going to make you better people as well. They're going to help you if you go for that challenging job interview. They're going to potentially help you on a first date if you find that particularly anxiety provoking. But they are really life skills that can help people to deal with the challenges that life may throw at them, but also helping them to maximize their own potential, and whatever that may be. Because as Andy quite rightly says, people that come into cycling early on aren't necessarily all going to become Olympic or elite champions, or in fact don't all want to become that. They actually just want to do it for recreation and enjoyment. But actually some of these principles can really maximize who they are as people and perhaps how they interact with those around them. If we start to just look at some of these principles in a little bit more detail, if we think about communication, I mentioned this earlier, but in general, successful people have good communication skills. And we see this across various domains. But actually, successful people ask questions. They challenge. They're not afraid to put their hand up and ask and get people to clarify. And as I said earlier, sometimes we might find that a little annoying. But actually, if we take a step back from it, that's actually what we want in our sessions. We want people not to necessarily just sit there and absorb everything we're saying. We actually want people to challenge what we're saying and to clarify or to maybe expand on some of the core messages and how it might work for them.
Just one point in that, it's great to have people standing out from the crowd. So a bit of recommended reading is Rod Ellingworth's book on how successful, how British cycling developed. But Rod talks about how Cav stood out from the crowd. He was always the one to speak. But through that, we developed the no hands up rule. So it's really important to recognize everyone within a group as well. So from that perspective, yes, it's really important to stand out from the crowd, but it's important to empower people to feel comfortable in standing out from the crowd, and simply asking questions with a no hands up rule can encourage people to develop in that way and not be shy in coming forward and standing out.
When we also think about communication as well, probably one thing not to discount is actually the body language that people demonstrate. So I'm a big believer that sometimes when people go into performance stressful situations, they can actually win that battle just by simply how they present themselves. So as a coach, sometimes we might go into sessions where we are under pressure, but actually by having a smile on our face, by sticking our chest out, by carrying ourselves tall, and by having a commanding entrance into an arena, we can actually fool people to believing that actually we're very, very confident. So sometimes communication isn't just about what we say verbally, it's about often how we convey it at a non-verbal level. And when we're talking to our athletes, it's a really quick win, if you like, to get them to think about their body language. You know, sometimes, you know, shrugging the shoulders, carrying their slouching, walking into a performance environment doesn't particularly give a good impression of themselves to those around them. So that's a really quick win whereby we can modify their body language to make them feel a little bit better about themselves. And we often talk about being actors when we go into stressful situations. Nobody ever expects people to smile under pressure, but we can all smile irrespective of whether we want to or not. And of course, when we smile, it releases endorphins into our body. It makes us feel good. It relaxes our face. It relaxes our body overall. So actually, by smiling, by engaging in it, whether we want to or not, is a really quick and easy win for us when we're perhaps going into stressful situations. The other thing about communication is really getting riders to pick a role model, getting them to think about somebody they like, somebody who's successful, and basically get them to copy them, get them to really model what they do in terms of their preparation, in terms of how they deal with success, and perhaps how they deal with failure. And also as coaches, we can all modify, or model, sorry, a hero, a mentor. We can copy what they do, particularly if they're engaging in good behaviours. We've just had a post from Luke Anderson, who's just commented here on Twitter. Any tips on thought and emotional control when working with typically erratic and emotional teenagers? And I think emotional control is something that we are going to finish with at the end. So hopefully we'll get onto that particular comment towards the end of proceedings. So we're coming on to the second of our 5 C's, and I mentioned quite a bit about self-confidence earlier, and for me it's probably the most important psychological factor. And I'm not just saying that just to pull the wool over your eyes. It's backed up by evidence. We find that self-confidence predicts performance the most. But it might be quite interesting to note where we get our confidence from. And actually, confidence is fantastic because it comes and goes. When we have it, everything feels great. When we don't, everything feels pretty crappy. And we actually want to stay indoors, probably not go out particularly much, and probably least of all go into competition. But when we have confidence, we feel fantastic. Really, self-confidence is influenced by these 3 things. And the first one is the most important. It's probably what we've done in the past. If we've been successful, that is going to have a huge impact upon how we feel moving forward. Secondly, is being encouraged. The language that coaches, that teammates, that ourselves, that we provide to ourselves and those individuals around us providers has a big impact upon how we feel. So I've worked in quite a lot of team sports, and sometimes in the team dressing room there'd be a lot of banter. There'd be a lot of comments from teammates joking around with another individual. And for example, I've heard comments like, "Oh, we're playing against such and such, and last year you had a particularly bad game against them." Now, at a dressing room level, that might be acceptable, and people might have a laugh and a joke about it. But actually, it's probably one of the worst things that anybody could say to somebody before they go out to compete. Because in terms of confidence, that individual will be deriving a lot of confidence from what people say to them. And reminding them of a past failure or of a past mistake is probably the worst thing that can happen, because it actually becomes at the forefront of their mind. So as coaches, as teammates, we have a big role in the type of language that we use in terms of developing confidence. So what should we be saying? We should be reminding our athletes of things that they're good at, things that they've done well at in the past, and things that they can actually control when they go into any particular environment. So actually remind them of the things that they need to do to ride well. And it sounds very, very basic, but if we remind people of the things they need to do well, it actually becomes very manageable, and they start to forget about all the other crap that might be out there, all the other rubbish thoughts, all the other distractions. They really start to channel their mind and focus on what they need to do well. The third thing is seeing others do well. So what we often find in team activities is if a rider goes particularly well early on, individuals would derive in that team a lot of confidence from how they do. So again, creating situations in practice when people are learning maybe difficult tasks or difficult drills of getting easy wins, getting people to do things progressively is quite a nice way to bolster self-confidence. I don't know if Andy wants to add anything on self-confidence and how, from a coaching.
Is really important. So having a positive culture within a team's great. Similarly, working with squads, having everyone aspirational and wanting to do really well and to push each other. So I think that's why we're so successful at British Cycling, in that we've got a winning culture. Riders are pushing each other all the time. So there is some ego, they want to outdo each other, but they're supportive of each other in that environment too. So it's seeing everyone at a world level on a consistent basis. We've got Olympic development riders, so that's 16, 17 years old, training with Olympic champions, so that they're within that environment, that they're seeing people just a few years older than themselves winning at the very highest level, and they aspire to be like people that they actually compete against in training, even though they're maybe 5-6 years down the path from maybe being on that top stage.
We've just had a tweet from Coaching Revolutions, and it reads, how do you balance confidence and overconfidence? Can you build and temper confidence? I think it's a really interesting point, and actually, whilst we say you can never have enough confidence, it is very true. You can never have enough confidence. But what sometimes often think is when we say that is that, well, won't people become arrogant if they become overconfident? Well, actually, no, because confidence and arrogance are at two ends of a continuum. They're at opposites, really. For example, highly confident people work hard. They work harder than people who are arrogant. Confident people are very persistent, so if things don't go well, they keep trying until they get them right. Arrogant people, on the other hand, tend not to put the hard work in. If they experience failure, they on occasions tend to not try, not to push on. And I think probably one of the most distinguishing factors between confidence and arrogance is that confident people set challenging targets. They're actually very good in their targets they set for themselves. Arrogant people tend not to set particular targets. And there was an example from professional soccer a number of years ago when a highly successful footballer was asked, or was said to have said to their coach, "I'm too good to train." And I think that really indicates an element of arrogance. That actually, for somebody to say that they were too good to train doesn't have any of the characteristics of confidence, because confident people, we do know, work extremely hard. For example, if we think of professional soccer players at the moment, we think of people like Cristiano Ronaldo, who would be the first into training and the last out of training. So irrespective of how good they are, they continually strive, they're continually pushing boundaries. So often confidence and arrogance seem to, sometimes people perceive them to be the same, but actually they're at complete opposites of each other. One way to think about in terms of developing self-confidence is about particularly visualizing what we've done in the past. And one way in which we can do this is through what we call visualization ammo. And this is quite a simple process to get athletes and riders to do, but pretty much get them to think about a time when they've done well and get them to almost write a little story for themselves. And this particular technique has been developed by a colleague of mine, Dr. Martin Turner. And what he gets his athletes to do is he would say, okay, think of a time when you've done well. What we want you to do then is write down how it made you feel, what you thought of in that particular situation, and what did you actually do. So you get individuals to really recreate these situations. And what you would do when they're going into maybe a stressful or a competition event, is get them to go through this visualization ammo to actually remind themselves of this particular good time and good successful time that they've had in the past. Thinking about concentration, we all know that the ability to focus effectively, the ability to concentrate on the task at hand is really important for elite performance, but also as well important for any rider at any level to really focus on the things that are important. As soon as they start to get distracted, they're likely to make a mistake, they're likely to not pay attention and probably fall off, and which might involve some form of injury. And sports psychologists typically agree that athletes need to attend to what we call the most appropriate cues. Easier said than done, because often we find a lot of riders and athletes will be thinking about sometimes things that are really irrelevant to what they're doing. They might often be going around a velodrome thinking about what they're going to have for their tea. They might be thinking about what's on TV later on rather than actually what they do to need to ride well. And it was really important, a really important message, I think, was that when Sir Chris Hoy was competing in the Beijing Olympics, he was asked what was he actually thinking when he was going on the time trial. And he actually said, I just focused on getting a good grip. And often people might think that that's so simplistic, but actually the thought of getting a really good grip at the start was crucial to him having a successful ride. So sometimes it's really about focusing on task-relevant pieces of information, not getting distracted by those things around us. So therefore, as coaches, really just trying to remind athletes of the things they need
Intentional cues. One thing that we see here at the National Cycling Centre is BMX riders going out and practicing skills and techniques within the car park. So they may be performing at the highest level, but what the coaches do, they want to improve concentration so the riders don't have to be thinking about riding berms, riding doubles or whatever. They take them out into the car park to really enable them to concentrate on developing specific skills in an environment that doesn't distract them. And once they've gained some mastery of the skill or technique, then they come back car park and cones environment like many of our coaches use on a weekly basis. So our level 1 and 2 coaches are doing exactly the same as the elite performers and working in exactly the same environment for exactly the same reasons.
Just on dealing with distractions and just picking up on some of Andy's points there, that sometimes as individuals become more developed and more skilled, it's often really good to practice with distractions, to actually have training sessions where there are lots of distractions, visual, verbal, going on around them. And actually what we work on is the basis of what we call desensitization. So we actually put lots of things in the environment that can distract people. And what we're really after is seeing how they cope with that. And that's really quite a progressive. We reflect on that and we say, how could we have improved? Do we need to think about focusing on relevant cues? And of course, if people maximize and do well under those conditions, we can begin to see that they're beginning to develop these type of resources. One way to really help people develop concentration is to really think about what they do before the race or before competition. We often find that this is a really crucial period. People prior to a race will start to almost talk themselves out of what's going on. They will start to think irrationally. They will start to think about their opponents. They will start to think about the condition of the track, maybe the weather, maybe other factors about who's watching them, what people think. All of which, actually at its rawest and logical level, are not going to help us race anyway, in any form. The things that are really going to help us race well are actually the things that we can control, and the thoughts, the feelings, and the behaviours that will help us maximise. So if we think back to the Sir Chris Hoy quote of focusing on getting a good grip, that keeps it very, very simplistic and real for us. So in terms of a pre-performance routine, we could encourage our riders to really develop about having a physical warm-up. Within that, we can think about them then listening to music. And often the mistake that athletes make here is that they just listen to any old music. They might listen to their favorite music. But actually what we want is music that relates to the activity that they're going to do. So there'd be no point probably listening to classical relaxing music before we're going to have to go and do something that's really ballistic and high powered. What it would make sense to do is to listen to music that's euphoric, uplifting, and in some way quite emotional, but emotional in a positive way. And maybe music that has lyrics that but actually it has no relationship to them, it has no emotional connection to them whatsoever, but they often just choose it because they've heard other people do it. So I think the choice of music, we see a lot of athletes do it, but actually let's think about the type of music that we choose. Is it creating the right ambience for the coaching session? Is it helping the athlete to get prepared for what they're about to do? And whilst they're on the bike, we can be listening to this music, but we can also be using self-statements. We can also be using the visualization ammo. When we're talking about self-statements, we can be reminding ourselves and reminding our riders of that they are good riders, they've done well in distract them and think about their opponents too much. That's a really nice, simple routine that can really help maximize concentration. And just lastly, just thinking about our last C, and hopefully answering some of the tweets that we had earlier on, we think about emotional control. And as I mentioned earlier, people often get worried and anxious about things they in their phones to see what the weather forecast is. And I kind of say to them in a flippant way, unless they have divine influence, they're unlikely to change the weather. So it actually makes no sense to focus on that or get worried about it. It makes more sense to focus on awareness of what they're thinking, how they're feeling, so that it's helpful. And it's quite normal for people to get anxious, and actually we can embrace that. We can say, actually, this is your body's way of just getting excited for something that's meaningful. We don't really ever want to get rid of those nerves because actually it's our body's way of getting itself prepared for a stressful encounter. And that's good because it means our bodies are likely to be ready. But what we can all do is just remind individuals of things that are controllable. So what we do in this exercise that you'll see on the screen is just get people to write down some of the things that they can control when going out to compete or going into a training session. And there are, for example, things like effort. I choose how hard I work or not. So as a rider, you can really reinforce that. You can say, actually, the control today, I choose the amount of effort I expend. It's up to them. It's up to nobody else. You can also have control over the thoughts we have and giving them ownership of, actually, you choose whether you believe that you can succeed or fail in this particular task. We can also as well think about some of the remind them with the helpful behaviors. So going through a pre-performance routine, as we saw earlier, is something that they control. That is, it's something they do, and it's likely to be helpful. And maybe another last controllable is their self-talk. Reminding athletes, riders, that actually they control what they think, nobody else. And therefore, they can start to take complete ownership of those type of things. So I guess just before we bring things to a close, what we've tried to do, certainly from a psychological point, is hopefully increase your awareness of maybe the role of psychology in coaching, and also how this might impact upon your behavior when coaching with riders, and also as well talking about some of these core psychological skills based around this 5 C's model that we've been talking about. And just as a reminder, here we have the 5 C's framework again, just so that we have an idea of how these all impact upon the rider. So we can see here that these will be evolutionary, that the rider and the coach will be working to develop these core skills, these core areas, and in doing so, hopefully we end up maximizing not only the rider, there's experience of cycling, but also probably generating them to be better people who can deal with stress better, they can deal with life situations, and hopefully transfer into other life settings. Just some truths about sports psychology. It's months and hours of work for individuals to develop them. And the role of the coach is really about, I guess, understanding them, understanding the role that you can play in helping riders to develop them, but also, I guess, importantly, reflecting, nurturing, and developing these over time. And where we can, try to really integrate some of these skills into training so that it becomes second nature to what riders do. So they actually don't have any preconceived or misconceptions about psychology. They just see it as simply something they do because it's been embedded in their training programs since they started. And I guess that just kind of brings things to a close at this stage. I think Andy's just got a couple of things to say, but thanks very much for listening, and we hope that you've gathered some interesting and useful information for your own practice.
No, absolutely superb, Jamie. Thanks very much for your input there. I've certainly learned quite a bit this evening, and that's the great thing about coaching, that we never stop learning. There's so much to know about, and I think about myself as an expert in the area, but it's really great to have someone in that I'm learning from, and it's the same no matter how experienced, how good we are as coaches, there's always something new to learn. Now, we'll pass over to Melissa, that she's been monitoring questions over there in Colorado. Now, the ones that we can't address this evening, we'll certainly do our best to answer them at a later date through a blog article on the British Cycling website, and we'll get it posted up on TrainingPeaks hopefully as well, so that if you've had questions and we've not been able to answer them tonight, we'll certainly get back to you so everyone gets the benefit from your questions. So over to Melissa.
Thanks, Andy and Jamie. So we have time for just about one question. However, we did collect a good amount of questions, and what we'll do is we'll put it together, some of the more frequently asked questions, and we'll come up with a blog post, and we'll get that out there. So if you didn't get your questions answered while the gentlemen were going through everything, we will be putting something together, so hopefully you'll get those answered. The one question I have right now is, how do you work with young riders to manage confidence following things like a bad crash, a run of poor results, or simply not riding at the level that they should be riding at? Are there any tips on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really nice example, and I guess that's a fairly common thing across many sports. And in that situation, when we're in a slump or when we've had a particularly bad run of form or an injury, it's about, you know, maybe going back to some of the things we've spoken about this evening about the visualization ammo, and really trying to recall situations in the past when we've done well. And of course, that's held in our memories. We can recall it whenever we want. Another good technique, particularly with injured athletes, is using video. So sometimes what we do is we would show, particularly at the higher end, we would show individuals, you know, periods of when they were performing well to remind them of some of their past experiences. If an athlete has been injured and it's a fairly common injury that maybe another athlete has had, we would show those or give an example of, actually, this rider had this injury and look at what they've gone on to achieve now. Because again, we draw confidence from those around us, and people with similar issues, similar challenges, we can draw a lot of inspiration and confidence from. But I think in terms of the support network, it's important for a coach, psychologist, the parents to actually remind the athlete of that they are good, remind them of the qualities they have, get them to think about things that they can control, and really probably start to work on what they visualize, but also what they say to themselves. Because often when we're returning from injury, there's a lot of doubt. You know, am I going to be the same again? Is it going to happen again? And that's where the concentration issue can be a big factor. So trying to get people to tune into the things that they can control, things that they need to do to perform well, I guess. So really trying to create a positive culture when people are in perhaps a lack of performance state. It's worth bearing in mind as well that confidence will always be variable. It will fluctuate, and often trying to outline that to people can be quite liberating. So I often say to some people in the sports I work in that actually in this particular sport you will fail more times than you succeed. That's just how it is. They often never quite have that perspective. They often assume that every time they compete they have to win. But when you often say to them, look, statistically, you fail more times than you succeed, that's often a little bit more liberating. They often go, okay, that kind of makes sense. I can have a bad day. And then we can kind of say, well, because of that, confidence will ebb and flow. It's not always going to be bulletproof or robust. And therefore, that's a little bit more liberating for them as well. So they can start to say that at certain times throughout the season, they may have confidence and they won't. But I think really it's about some of those skills that we've said earlier. I think Andy probably got a couple of things he perhaps wants to add.
Yeah, simply about focusing on process rather than outcome as well is really important. So if riders are developing and improving continually and they're not winning, they're still, from my perspective, being successful because they're getting better. So it's important, again, going back to the controllables, to control your own behaviour. You can't control what others do in competition. So if you're third, fourth, fifth, sixth in a race, but you're improving, or you're developing skills, techniques, tactics, reflective practice, understanding what's going well, what's not going so well, then the chances are that with that development, success will eventually come. It's also not viewing success as winning all the time. It's simply self-development and achieving what individuals want to achieve from the sport. So I think one thing we see in Olympic sport or elite sport is that people are judged on, or the sports are judged on Olympic medals. However, what we see here are that many of the coaches working for the Great British cycling team have been those riders who have not made it at the highest level, but they've still become top coaches because they understand the environment, they understand the experiences of the riders, and they understand failure. So they're better coaches as a result. So they're extremely successful, even though they've not been successful on the highest sporting platform.
Just got 2 points probably just to add. I guess really important thing about bolstering confidence as well is about controlling the controllables. It's a bit of a cliched statement, but it really is very true that often when we're in a slump, we start to think illogically, we start to think about things that aren't helpful. And by controlling the controllables, focusing on what we need to do well, that's often a very staple diet for people. And just lastly, reflective practice has been found to be a really useful tool, intervention, to help people to develop self-confidence as well.
Right, I think we'll wrap it up there. So thanks very much for everyone taking time out of their evening to attend the webinar, and thanks to Melissa and particularly TrainingPeaks for hosting the webinar. It's great to have that platform here in the UK, in the United States, and the rest of the world. And I'd like to thank Jamie for his time this evening and giving us a great deal of insight into psychology. So thanks once again, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks, everyone.